Hi, everybody. Welcome to week one, lecture two. The title of today's lecture is The World the Founders Made, the World That Made the Founders. So it's like two titles together. Obviously, we're going to be looking at the context that gave us the founders and then what the founders gave us and how that still shapes our context today. More specifically, here's an agenda for today. So we're going to start with a case study. Thomas Paine, Original American, kind of riffing off the podcast you hopefully listened to for your talkback. We're going to look at the Enlightenment and the birth of human rights, which again is the most important context for understanding the founders. We're also going to talk about WASPism and its discontents. Now, probably none of you or most of you have not heard of the word WASPism. As soon as I define it, you will know what it is. Don't worry. It's just an academic term for something you probably already know. And then we're going to look at how those big ideas trickled down to actually shaping the founding documents. And then again, we're kind of doing multiple things here. What shaped the founders, what shaped the documents, and then how did the founding documents still shape us? And to kind of explore that, I'm going to look at two case studies. Case study one is citizenship and slavery in the Constitution, and how some of the what we call the slave clauses or slavery clauses still shape things today, arguably. And then for case study two, we're going to look at federal elections and gerrymandering. Which again, if you don't know what gerrymandering is, you probably will have heard of it once I explain it to you. And it is a direct result of, some things that are or are not in the Constitution. So it should be an interesting day. Again, as usual, we're combining two classes into one, so we have a lot to get through, but hopefully give you a lot for your brain to chew on. Here on out, pretty much every lecture is going to have what I call a big idea. Notice there's a blue star saying you should write this down if you're taking notes. The big idea is what it says it is the main point of kind of the first half of the lecture. So today we're going to have two big ideas, one for the first part, one for the second part. The first part's big idea is this: the United States did not appear out of nowhere. The revolution and the founding documents emerged from the larger context of European modernity, the Enlightenment, and WASPism. So again, these are the three kind of larger contexts we're going to look at that shape the founders: modernity, enlightenment, and WASPism. Now, before really digging into the founders, I want to I pulled some random things off of Twitter, right? A lot of people have a lot of feelings about the founders of this country. For example, this person named Gimme the Loot back in April 2021 had this to say: the founders were racist, genocide-enabling colonizers who dehumanized and enslaved people, or tolerated those things and profited either way. Why would anyone seriously invoke them now or ever? I'm screaming, right? So this is kind of more of a hard left view, right? That like the founders were terrible. Why should we continue to talk about them? Then kind of on the other side, we have this guy, the real Bellevue, tweeted in 2022. Have you ever contemplated how truly providential it was that some of the most brilliant minds in history, our founders, existed contemporary with each other at the same time and place in history? It is nothing short of divinely inspired. America is truly exceptional. So again, this is a complete opposite view, right? This person is basically saying that is kind of referencing a view that the founders were actually like providentially, in other words, kind of like by God, inspired by God to write the founding documents. And there are some people who actually believe the Constitution is inspired the way that some Christians believe the Bible is, right? So again, totally opposite view. And then somewhere in the middle here, we have Ayanna Pressley. Some of you might know her. She's in the House of Representatives in DC. Our founding fathers were not living gods, they were fallible human beings. The Declaration of Independence did not condemn slavery, protect the rights of women, or include Native Americans. So we have kind of a middle view, right? They did some things really well, they did some things not so well. But regardless, I'm sure most of you are coming to this class, particularly if you grew up in the United States, I think, with some opinions about the founders. And in fact, I think this is such an interesting issue that I asked you in your survey, which I know some of you haven't done yet. If you haven't done yet, it's fine. But I was able to pull some data from some of the responses you all gave as well, combining them with some other students from previous years. So when I asked you the question to fill in the blank here, this is what you and some past students have said. The men who founded this country were the founding fathers, very literal, right? The pilgrims, interesting. Not representative of the people living in it in the United States, right? White, radical leftists in their time. Men who desired a land of freedom where one day everyone would be equal. They were visionaries. They were not expecting the Constitution to be unchanged for 250 years. They were the best. They were people, each with their own features and flaws. So again, we have a range of opinion in this class and just in general society about the legacy of the founders, how we should view them. Are they heroes? Were they terrible racists? Were they somewhere in between? And here we have a really representative kind of range of opinion as well. Some of these I agree with, some of these I don't. Doesn't really matter. But the point is that a lot of people have a lot of feelings about the founders. So I think it's good to keep this in mind. That again, we're all coming to this with biases and opinions, and hopefully we'll be able to like set those aside a little bit, just to kind of try to take a look at them through a fresh lens, I hope. And again, I think a good way to start that is by starting out with a guy named Thomas Paine. Okay, just to set the context, this is a map of the American colonies roughly 3 decades before the American Revolution, right? So we have all these colonies which would eventually become states, right? But these are British colonies, right? America is not a country. America is not its own separate entity. It is an overseas colony of the British Empire. And people living in the American colonies did not view themselves as American. They view themselves as British citizens, right? And one of the people to really kind of reconfigure and kind of challenge that was this guy, Thomas Paine. Now, I'm not going to re-lecture on what the podcast said. Hopefully you enjoyed the podcast, lots of interesting details. And again, kind of like resurrecting a really important figure that kind of gets forgotten because, this podcast said he was kind of a jerk and alienated all of his friends. But he's really important for our class, right? Because what is an American? Well, Thomas Paine is where we have to start because he really was the first person to make Americans something to be proud of, right? So let me explain this a little bit. Again, I'm going to repeat some things from the podcast and kind of add some details as well. So American, the word American, was originally used to describe the indigenous people, what we now call Native Americans or American Indians, right? So initially, that's what that term meant. By the mid-1600s, the term had kind of evolved and expanded, as words often do, to primarily apply to British colonists, right? So by the time we get to the early 1600s, if you said American, you're probably talking about a British colonist living in the American colonies. However, these colonists view themselves as British, right? They didn't view themselves as Americans. And in fact, American was often used as an epithet. Epithet means not a very nice word, to imply an unsophisticated backwater peasant. Right. So think about today, we might call like a white person from a rural environment, if we're being unkind, we might call them like a redneck or something, right? And so similar connotation there with the word American. It was not a word that people liked. And Thomas Paine really kind of single-handedly changed that, or at least introduced the idea that changed that. Thomas Paine's writing, particularly Common Sense, helped turn American into a badge of pride, a shedding of Britishness, and an embracing of a new national identity. So again, he was the first person to promote this idea, like, no, being an American doesn't suck. It's actually really awesome. And this was one of the reasons why it was able to unite the colonies, who thought of themselves as distinct political entities under a common identities, right? So in other words, like, I'm from this colony, you're from that colony, we're not all one thing. And this idea, like, no, 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 we're all Americans, that Thomas Paine introduced, was really, really, really powerful and was one of the most important kind of galvanizing moments leading up to the American Revolution. Now, for our purposes today, I also want to kind of pivot a little bit and introduce Thomas Paine to you as an Enlightenment thinker. So particularly, in addition to Common Sense, his other most famous piece of writing was something called The Rights of Man, which he wrote in support of the French Revolution. So again, quick refresher, America had the revolution, France, roughly a decade later, did the same thing. Turned out differently, but, this class is not called What is a Frenchman, so we're not going to worry about what happened in France. But suffice it to say that Thomas Paine's idea that really kind of galvanized the American Revolution was also really influential in France as well, particularly his writing, his work in The Rights of Man. And again, man at that time, man meant humankind, right? Men were in control, so man meant everybody, which, is unfortunate, but that's just the way the language was back then. And to give you a sense of really the kind of the rhetoric and the ideas of the Enlightenment, I want to play a snippet of somebody reading some portions of The Rights of Man as it was originally written by Thomas Paine.
That which is called aristocracy in some countries and nobility in others arose out of the governments founded upon conquest and is kept up by family tyranny and injustice. The idea of hereditary legislators is as inconsistent as that of hereditary judges, and as absurd as an hereditary mathematician. A body of men holding themselves accountable to nobody ought not to be trusted by anybody. The opinions of men with respect to government are changing fast in all countries. The revolutions of America and France have thrown a beam of light over the world. The enormous expense of governments have provoked people to think, and once the veil begins to rend, it admits not of repair. Ignorance is of a peculiar nature, and once dispelled, it is impossible to re-establish it. What is government? More than the management of the affairs of a nation. It is not, and from its nature cannot be, the property of any particular man or family, but of the whole community. And though by force it has been usurped into an inheritance, the usurpation cannot alter the right of things. Sovereignty, as a matter of right, appertains to the nation only, and not to any individual, and a nation has at all times an inherent right to abolish any form of government it finds inconvenient, and establish such as accords with its interest, disposition, and happiness.
Okay, the reason I'm starting with Thomas Paine again is I think he's a really interesting kind of case study for getting into the founders, right? And, let's again do this whole text reading thing. Let's say Thomas Paine's life is a text. How can we kind of read and interpret it to make some generalizations about kind of the world that the founders came from? Here's 2 points, I think. One is that Thomas Paine's influence and ideas reflect their times, right? Back then, pretty much all important ideas were credited to powerful white men, right? So again, the founders, yes, they were all white men, but that was pretty much who was running society at the time. So I don't know what other configuration there could have been, for better or for worse. Secondly, his ideas also demonstrate the rhetoric of the European Enlightenment. This is really what I want to look at in this first half. What was the Enlightenment? What were the actual basic ideas that came out of it? How did those ideas shape the founders? And then how did those ideas via the founders end up in our founding documents? So now moving on from Thomas Paine as our little case study and intro to this idea, let's get right into the European Enlightenment. But before really getting into the Enlightenment, we got to go back a little bit further. So it's going to be pretty quick. I promise this is going to be a brief overview of what kind of Middle Age or medieval Europe was like. Again, it's a huge span of history, 1,000 years. It's really hard to smush 1,000 years of history into a few slides, but I'm going to try to do that just to give you an idea of how Middle Age Europeans thought and how different the Enlightenment was, right? So let's look into that. Again, the Middle Age worldview. If you lived in the Middle Age Europe, England or whatever, how would you view the world? This is probably what it would be like. One was that things were shaped by tradition. See, my dates are a little different here, but just ignore that. One was that life was shaped by tradition, right? The church controlled politics, economics, science, etc. Education meant learning and proving that tradition was right, right? So like that sounds weird. That sounds like the opposite of education, but at the time, tradition and authority and hierarchy were really, really, really important. And the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church is still a huge and powerful institution, but it's hard to imagine an institution as powerful as the Catholic Church today. Pretty much every major sector of kind of politics and society was controlled by the Catholic Church, right? And they owned most of the land. They were huge. It was unbelievably enormous. And they also generally dictated what people believed and thought, right? So much so that if you went to college, you went to, now called college, university, which generally speaking was only educated people with money were sending their kids to universities, or people studying to be monks or nuns or whatever. And if you went to a university, you studied the classics, right? You studied Aristotle, and you studied under teachers who were not trying to get you to do things like think critically, like think for yourself, like come up with new ideas. It really was, here are all these old ideas and they're traditions, so they're true, and you should just need to learn them and prove that they're true over and over and over and over again, right? Which to us doesn't sound like education, but again, they had a completely different worldview than what we had. What was important to them was not important to us. Second, related to that was hierarchy, right? Everything in life was hierarchical. Your place in life was preordained. You ruled or you were ruled, and there was no changing that, right? So this idea of like, I was born in this state, but I'm going to work my way up. That was not an idea. That was actually heretical. That was against God, because God put you in whatever place you were in, and you should be happy with that, right? And there are really interesting like drawings and illustrations to capture this. So there's this idea in the medieval world we know as the Great Chain of Being, right? So basically, all of life can be put on a hierarchy from greatest to least, right? So here we have Deus is God, angels. I can't remember off the top of my head what that is. I'm going to skip that. People. These are animals, plants, fire, right? And it just keeps going down to like kind of like basic kind of physical things like rocks and whatnot, right? And this is how medieval people viewed the world. Here's a kind of another similar illustration. This is showing the human world, right? Here we have God, and here we have all the angels, and then we have the rulers, and then we have the common people, and then we have everything under that, right? So whatever station in life you were born into, that's what station God wanted to give you, right? So you see, probably hope we're already thinking like how I'm setting us up for the Enlightenment, right? This idea that like people have inherent worth and value, and people should be able to work to make themselves better. This is a totally new idea in human history, right? This is how people had thought pretty much since forever. This even touched science, right? When medieval people looked up at the heavens, this is what they saw. They believed that, circle was perfect. So therefore, everything above the heavens went in a perfect circle around the Earth. And obviously, the Earth is in the center. And here we see, the moon and the various planets and the sun, and they were viewed as almost as these perfect orbs that perfectly circled around the Earth. And the further out you got, the more perfect it got. And what about this? The firmament. What is that? Well, the firmament is basically it's a verse from the Hebrew Bible, the creation story, right? The story where God makes the world in 6 days. On the second day, it says God made the firmament. Well, what was that? Well, they didn't know. Honestly, we didn't know until maybe within the past 100 years that a bunch of archaeologists found a bunch of other ancient Near Eastern literature. Now we do know what the firmament is. You can Google it if you want. But at the time, the Bible said God made the firmament, so clearly the firmament's a thing. So they believe that the firmament was basically this like kind of hard, solid wall with the stars in, kind of pushed, almost like push pins, like the stars were kind of like smushed to the firmament, and they just kind of sat out there, right? So this is what they saw when they looked up at the heavens. Why? Well, because the world is hierarchical, and the hierarchy was shaping even their very kind of like scientific eye, right? Third point, very related to the previous one, pre-scientific thinking, right? Problems were solved using folk medicine, magic, religious rituals, and timeless wisdom, right? The idea of looking to the environment to find new solutions, to come up with new things, that was just emerging. People generally didn't think that way. All wisdom and truth what was in the past, and we just needed to go back and find that truth and wisdom and live it out today. So part of the medieval worldview, kind of the scientific worldview, I guess, was that the body was basically composed of four essences or things they called humors. They included blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, which you see represented here if you could do the translation work. And basically, if you got sick, it meant that your fluids were out of whack, right? This is why they used to bleed people and things like that. Now, again, to our eyes today or ears, it's like this has nothing to do with science, but this was received tradition that they got from, I believe, the ancient Greeks or the Romans, can't remember which. This was a belief that had been around for centuries, and hey, we don't need to come up with new beliefs. All the great beliefs are there for us. We just need to go back and find them in the original sources, right? Also, a lot of people, like witchcraft and devilry, and oftentimes when, if you've seen this picture, when women in particular got too unruly, they're often thought of as, kind of dealing with the devil. And, these were like facts for people, right? That the devil actually walked around and actually possessed people, and there are all these rituals and stuff to kind of deal with that, right? But which now we probably say it was maybe mental health stuff. I don't know, but the point is they did not have a scientific worldview that we have today, right? So what changed? Well, a lot of things changed, but the best way to kind of encapsulate them and collapse them all into one concept is modernity happened, right? So what was modernity? Roughly starts in the 15th century. Again, the 15th century is the 1400s, right? Centuries and years they line up with work weird. But modernity was an era in which Western Europeans gradually, and I say gradually, right? Because this was like one person here, a small group of people here, and eventually the ideas got bigger and bigger and eventually kind of took over Europe, right? So Western Europeans gradually rejected medieval beliefs and embraced all things modern. And I mean modern in the historical sense of a particular era, including capitalism, rational science, democracy, overseas colonialism, religious skepticism, and secularism. So religious skepticism is doubting that religion is true. Secularism is keeping religion out of kind of politics, right? And all of these things start to emerge at the same time. All over Europe, different people are asking different questions and coming up with really interesting conclusions. And eventually, historians in retrospect note that eventually there was a huge shift and the medieval era ended and the modern period began, right? Now, today, when we say the word modern, we might mean more generally just stuff current or stuff happening right now, and that's fine. However, in this context, when I say modern, I'm talking about a particular period that gave us things like the Enlightenment that we're going to talk about soon. This new thing called modernity. Well, it was a broad movement that had a lot of pieces, but they were all kind of brought together by this. One of them was questioning tradition. All past traditions and claims to truth must be re-examined in the light of reason. So, for example, this boy in this picture is king. Why is this boy king? Well, because his father was king. Well, why? Well, because that's tradition. Well, does that make sense? Is that reasonable? Is that rational? Does it make sense that like this 12-year-old boy should reign over an entire geographical region just because that's tradition? Maybe that doesn't make so much sense, right? Or what about the Pope, right? The Pope basically gets to tell us what to believe. Does that make sense? Like, shouldn't we be able to read the Bible or come up with our own beliefs for ourselves and commune with God by ourselves? yeah, maybe this doesn't make sense, right? So this is what modernity was about. Look at all this stuff we've been doing for a long time. Why are we doing it, right? Let's really question that. Related to that was challenging hierarchy. Humans have natural rights was a core modern belief. People should be educated so they can make up their own minds and choose their own paths in life, right? So again, it's not like in the medieval era. It's like, well, you were born poor. That's where God wanted you. You shouldn't try to change that. And people started challenging that. Like, why are some people in charge and other people not, right? This doesn't make any sense. Maybe people should be able to make up their own minds, right? Maybe the people in charge are just in charge because they were born there, not because God put them there. Maybe, like this guy, Martin Luther said, maybe we shouldn't listen to the church. Maybe we should read the Bible for ourselves. And, I'm sure you all know the Protestant Reformation. We're going to come back and talk about it later on in the class when we talk about religion. However, for now, suffice it to say that a lot of people, in retrospect, historians, view the Reformation as a modern movement, right? I don't want the Catholic Church telling me what to believe. I'm going to read the Bible myself. And in fact, as Martin Luther did, which you see represented here on the right, I'm going to print the Bible in everyday language, which in his context was German, so that more and more and more people could read it. Well, this was insane. This was heretical. This was against God. Why? Because it challenged hierarchy, right? And this was what modernity was very much about, was looking at the way we used to do things and saying maybe they don't need to be done that way anymore. And the third component that's really important is to understand scientific rationalism, right? Knowledge about the world should be based on objective observation and methodical experimentation, right? Who cares what a bunch of Greeks and Romans said thousands of years ago? let's do experiments and see how the world actually works. In the medieval era, astronomers looked up at the sky and they saw beautiful perfection, right? Because that's what their hierarchical kind of worldview told them to see. But as scientific rationalism comes into play more, astronomers start throwing that stuff out and say, well, like these old models don't make sense. They're not seeing the actual data that I see here. So I'm going to ignore the old models and I'm going to create new models based on observation, based on experimentation, and based on things that other people can replicate and prove to be true, right? And all of this is coalescing also at the time of the Italian Renaissance, right? So you have this incredible fervor to kind of explore and find new things and put out new ideas, but also kind of realizing that part of what it means to be European is that that there were these periods when like art and music and philosophy and political theory and debate all really flourished, right? So all this stuff is all coalescing all at the same time, and eventually some historians or cultural commentators or whatever designate this an era of enlightenment, right? It's the age of reason is also what's called sometimes. This era where Europe has kind of in the minds of the people who are participating in it anyway, has kind of emerged from this like medieval slumber where we're all controlled by superstition and old traditions don't make any sense, but we're sweeping all those away and we're doing something brand new. And this is what the Enlightenment was. I'm going to riff a little bit more on the Enlightenment to get more specific, but first I'm going to pause and play you a little video just to give you a kind of a broader overview of what this movement was about.
The Enlightenment, or Age of Light, refers to the belief that the musty old ideas needed to be exposed to the light of rational investigation to see if they were still valuable. The bright light of reason needed to shine on tradition. And this momentous challenge to tradition came about during a time in which Europe was being completely transformed in many ways that are sometimes forgotten amid all the excitement about Voltaire and reason. So let's go straight to the thought bubble today. Beyond the wars and state building we've already seen, increasing abundance and novelty was creeping into the everyday lives of Europeans. Coffee, tea, chocolate, tobacco, and other commodities led to experimentation. For instance, one English housewife saw tea for the first time and thought it was meant to be baked as a kind of pie filling. A diplomat said that tea and coffee had brought a greater sobriety and civility to everyday life in Europe. Europe had previously been a land of famine and mere subsistence for essentially all of its history, but now the cultivation of new foods from the Americas, like potatoes and corn, along with literally thousands of other new plants, meant that available calories were increasing, and it also introduced the idea that maybe the world didn't have to be perpetually on the brink of starvation and catastrophe. To replace the old stuffy ways of monarchs and priests and aristocrats telling us that we were already living in a perfect world, people needed to learn how to embrace the newly desirable traits of the Enlightenment, like being honest and inquisitive and open. Swiss thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau had many ideas about education reform, for instance. He wasn't a wealthy or titled person, but rather was born into a watchmaking family and lived among artisans. His best-selling novel, Emile, describes a boy who grows up not in a city or a palace, but in a countryside where one can be oneself, a natural individual. Instead of experiencing common rote learning with large doses of religious and classical reading, Emile learns carpentry and gardening and other practical skills. In the countryside, he behaves in what Rousseau saw as the best possible way, naturally and without pretentious airs. Rousseau promoted what would come to be called middle-class values, like hard work, practicality, and domesticity for women. In general, Enlightenment aims were more worldly than spiritual. In Scotland, philosopher David Hume promoted reason above religion, concluding that belief in God was mere superstition. Some people, called deists, argued that God existed, but that he didn't have influence on everyday life after having set in motion the machinery of the universe. Many important founding fathers in the United States were deists, and if you believe, as many philosophers did, that God keeps a distance from human affairs, then the persecution of people for their religious beliefs starts to seem like cruel fanaticism. So Enlightenment views also fed into rising movements in Britain and France and the Netherlands and their colonies to abolish slavery. By this time, the slave trade was massive, and there was growing acknowledgement of its cruelty. In 1770, the French Catholic abbe, or clergyman, Guillaume Raynal, laid out the violent devastation of native peoples by invading Europeans, and in 1788, the freed slave Olaudah Equiano described the Middle Passage after he had been kidnapped in present-day Nigeria and enslaved. Now, Equiano is often believed to have been born in South Carolina, and his riveting memoir may have been cobbled together from the harrowing tales of others, but still, it was a bestseller, and it captured the inhumanity of white people toward black people and advocated Enlightenment freedom and human rights for all. It also stirred freedmen and slaves alike to struggle for abolition. And philosopher and author Moses Mendelssohn used the more tolerant atmosphere to express his optimism about the future of Jews in Europe. Because of the Enlightenment emphasis on reason, he believed that the age-old persecution of Jewish people would soon end. Of course, we know now that wasn't the case, and that much exploitation and oppression has taken place under the guise of reasoned thought. Pseudoscientific reason has been used to justify many forms of structural inequality, from racism to sexism to class systems. Rationality would not prove to be a way out of the human urge to create and marginalize outsiders. But Enlightenment thought was nonetheless transformative, and seeking worldly explanations for inequality and injustice did have significant real-world consequences. I mean, no longer would we see earthquakes merely as acts of God. Enlightenment challenges to the idea that we were already living in the best of all possible worlds would also help us to imagine and eventually to live in better worlds, albeit ones that are still profoundly imperfect.
Okay, hope that gave you a good overview. Let's get into more specifics. I'm going to highlight some things that the speaker said, but also add some other things I think are important. So, the antecedent of the European Enlightenment was really colonialism. So in the 1500s, colonialism and slavery brought Europeans unparalleled wealth, increased nutrition, leisure products such as tea and sugar, and a more global view of humanity. Also, the Renaissance repopularized classical philosophies and political theories. So again, as the video said, it was pretty bad to be European in the medieval era. You might starve, but colonialism brought increased wealth, nutrition, and just kind of like a sense of kind of optimism and forward-lookingness that Europe had never really experienced before. Obviously, there's some very negative sides of colonialism, although it was good for the people who benefited from it, as we're going to get into more, was not good for everybody. So again, this all starts with Columbus. People debate whether was he the first, second, third, whatever. It doesn't matter. The important thing is that when he landed in the New World, that really eventually would lead to the floodgates coming. As various European powers colonized what is now South America, Central America, Caribbean, as well as North America, United States and Canada. And the immediate benefit, though, for Europe was really like increased health and just a better life in general, right? If you're running your economy off of the exploitation of others, well, sucks for them, but it's usually good for you, right? Just gives you more time to relax, especially for people kind of in this growing kind of middle class. So with all this wealth and nutrition, a new privileged class emerged in Europe. And they started arguing, some of them, not all of them, but many of them started arguing for a rejection of quote unquote medieval ideas. This is really in the era when that word starts to emerge as kind of like a negative term, in favor of modern ones. Feudal lords and the church were challenged by humanism, rational science, free markets, right, is the birth of capitalism, and the consent of the governed versus royal succession, right? So people should rule us because we elect them to rule us, not because their dad ruled us and they died and the next person in line gets it, right? That's so all these ideas start kind of flourishing all at the same time. You also have the rise of the middle class. Today we take the middle class for granted as a thing that most of us kind of identify with in America. The middle class is a pretty new idea. A lot of this, again, colonialism and capitalist activity, within that, a new kind of intellectual elite, a middle class elite starts to emerge, hanging out in places like coffee houses, which at that time were really important kind of centers of intellectual ferment in kind of Enlightenment era Europe. Also, they were really influenced by the Greeks and Romans, right? So they updated Greco-Roman ideas, and by doing that, philosophers argued that all humans, right, had fundamental natural rights. For example, John Locke, who I think easily is the most important Enlightenment thinker on the founders of this country, John Locke argued that all humans had rights to life, freedom, and property, which he meant the ability to use natural resources to create goods. Now, today we take these ideas for granted, but when people started saying these things, they were new ideas, right? If you lived in medieval Europe and you were just born a poor peasant, well, that was it, right? You didn't have fundamental rights. Privileged people had rights, you didn't. And some of the Enlightenment thinkers started saying, well, that's stupid. Why? Why doesn't everybody have rights, right? Why? I mean, we're all created equal. Why don't we all have rights? And people just started questioning things like this. Okay, so this is the current royal family of the United Kingdom, right? This is the line of succession. In other words, if he dies, then he's the next person, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of founders were like, why? Doesn't make any sense. Why don't we do it this way? Why don't we let people vote for and pick who rules them, right? This doesn't make any sense anymore. And this is part of the reason why we have things like checks and balances in our Constitution, right? So the founders of this country were used to this guy, King George III, I believe, who was, not a great or beloved ruler, monarch, but he was a monarch. Why? Because he was born into it. And they thought it was just stupid that there was all this power concentrated in one person, in one office. I mean, they did have parliament back then, but it was really complicated. It wasn't as clearly separated between parliament or among parliament and the crown. So when they set up our government, they separated the powers, right? They said we're going to have three branches. Each branch will have unique powers, and each branch we would check the power of the others, right? Well, why? Well, because again, part of the Enlightenment was questioning hierarchy and the way things had done, and they had seen what happens when you concentrate a bunch of power in one person's hands, so they wanted to rationalize the process and separate them and make it different, right? And guys like this, John Locke. So this is a quote from John Locke: "All men by nature are equal in that equal right that every man hath to his natural freedom," very verbose, "without being subjected to the will or authority of any other man. Being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." Now, again, this is like common sense to us today. Like, well, duh. But at that time, no one had ever said this before. The idea that like all of us are created equal and that we're just different for reasons completely outside of like, God's ordained will. These ideas really caught on. Here's another quote from another influential Enlightenment thinker, Thomas Hobbes. "Government is necessary not because man is naturally bad, but because man is by nature more individualistic than social." So these are also like new ideas of human nature, right? Typically, the church, had complicated views on human nature, but for the most part, we were sinners who needed to be forgiven and brought into a relationship with God. And a lot of Enlightenment thinkers started questioning that. Like maybe we're not inherently bad. Maybe we're just inherently complex, right? And maybe we need to understand what that human nature is like and build government systems kind of around it, right? And people like Thomas Hobbes are a good example of that. This also led to people questioning a lot of like religious teaching. And basically, with this new Enlightenment focus on reevaluating the past and using reason and logic to determine what is actually true, you have the development of what we call like biblical criticism. So it's not so important that I mean, you can't read French, so it's just fine. Basically, this was written by a French monk in the 1600s. And it was kind of the first kind of European book where someone had pointed things out like, hey, if you read the stories of Jesus in the New Testament, sometimes the facts contradict each other, things like that, right? So it's very scandalous, controversial, but it was the beginning, again, of people kind of in an academic setting being able to reevaluate kind of old received wisdom. And some even took it further, as we're going to find out. For example, Thomas Jefferson, who really loved the Bible but didn't believe God ever did anything supernatural, so he basically took the Bible and cut out all the supernatural parts, right? So here's Jesus, gave him some really great moral teachings, we'll teach that. Here's Jesus doing a miracle, we're going to cut that part out. And then even really on the extreme end of the spectrum, you have folks like Voltaire, who is, a French writer, who said this: "The Bible, that is what fools have written, what imbeciles command, what rogues teach, and young children are made to learn by heart." Now, Voltaire's views were very shocking. They were very controversial. He was very much on the extreme end. He was not representative of most of the founders. However, it was just giving you an idea of what happened during the Enlightenment. It was like, you kind of rip the lid off and everything exploded out. Like, well, if we can challenge and question and critique everything, let's literally do that. And that is what happened during the Enlightenment. Last point, this is going to bring us back to the founders. Some Enlightenment thinkers, also argued that the fact of natural rights, so again, natural rights is not a fact. I can't set up a science experiment to prove to you that we all have natural rights, but during the Enlightenment, it became a fact. Does that make sense? It just became something that everybody agreed with, at least all the important thinkers agreed with. So some thinkers also argued that the fact of natural rights should compel governments to enshrine and protect legal rights for all people, not just royalty. Again, this was a new idea. Some of you probably know some of your history, the way the Magna Carta back in England in the 1200s. So there have been various times where people wrote down political documents to say who had rights and who didn't. It had never included everybody. As far as I know, at least, never before had anyone written a document that said everybody gets some kind of rights, right, under our new system. And this directly descends from the Enlightenment. This directly influences our founding documents. And again, directly shapes this question or idea of what does it mean to be an American? An American is someone with rights. Where does that come from? It comes from the Enlightenment. Here's one more quote to kind of drive the point home. This is from Baron de Montesquieu, who is probably one of the top 3 most influential thinkers on the founders. In the state of nature, all men are born equal. So again, he's saying that, equality is a fact of life. We're all born the same. But they being people cannot continue in this equality. Society makes them lose it, and they recover it only by protection of the law. So again, this is like core kind of founding document ideas. We're all born equal. We have to give up some of that equality to be part of a society. So therefore, the purpose of government, right, should be to recover and protect as much of that equality and freedom as possible. And these ideas were huge on the founders. In fact, so huge that some people have made the argument that, the American Revolution was an enlightened revolution. I don't mean enlightened in the sense of like it was, I think personally it was brilliant or not. Doesn't matter what I think. The point is that it was the first kind of military revolution directly influenced by the Enlightenment, at least I think at this level or at this complexity. And then here's just another final quote before we kind of move on a bit. From the Declaration of Independence, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, right? That is Enlightenment rhetoric there. That they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, some people might say, well, this kind of sounds like the Bible too, right? The Bible says all of us are equal before God. And, weren't the founders influenced by the Bible? The answer is yes, they were. However, I have yet to see any historical evidence that the Bible directly shaped their ideas that ended up in the founding documents. Christianity is a religion, right, largely started by this guy named Jesus of Nazareth, the first century Jew who walked around and cared about poor people and people on the outside of society. And he was teaching self-sacrifice and love for your enemies, and giving up what's best for you for other people. That is not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, folks. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are not like ideas the founders got from the Bible. These were Enlightenment ideas, right? All men are created equal. Yes, they're endowed by their creator. So I'm not saying, the founders were generally not atheists. They hadn't thrown God out the way like Voltaire, for example, had. But they had a more Enlightenment view of God that we're going to get into in a few weeks. But suffice it to say now that all men are created equal. This is the Enlightenment talking, like directly to us via our founding documents. So it's a really, really, really important piece of context to understand. Now, heavily related to that idea, but I think kind of separate-ish, is this idea of WASPism. I'm calling this section WASPism and its discontents. So a discontent is a person who is unhappy with something. So kind of acknowledging that, like even with the Enlightenment, right? Lots of great stuff, all the right stuff, people are equal, all that sounds great. But then there's also the slavery and colonialism thing that was kind of also in the mix, right? So we're going to kind of take the good with the bad and see some of the kind of, I guess, like darker aspects of the worldview that the founders had and how that shaped our founding documents as well. So let's define WASPism, which again, if you don't know what it is, as soon as I say it, you'd be like, oh. WASP is an acronym which stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or White Anglo-Saxon Protestantism if you put ism at the end. White Anglo-Saxon Protestantism formed the base of U.S. culture. Now, historians and sociologists debate the use of the term WASP. It can be used different ways in different contexts. I'm using it in the broadest sense just to point out the fact that this country was founded overwhelmingly by white English-speaking Protestants, right? Christians who were not Catholics, who spoke English, who were white, right? They form the basis of U.S. culture, and it's really important to understand what WASPism is, because some of it, I would say all of it, is still very much around with us. Some of it's more controversial, some of it's still okay, depending on your viewpoint. But here we go. This is what WASPism or WASP ideology really breaks down to. Western Christian morality, right? So again, right, bedrock at the center of kind of debates about morality all throughout American history before the Revolution. Christianity has been at the center of it, right? Self-reliance. Again, this ties into this whole individualism thing. So I think this was something that the founders had developing by the 1800s, and by the time de Tocqueville is around, he's really seeing this spread. But it's very related to individualism, this idea of like, if you want to do something, do it yourself. Male authority and traditional family roles, right? American society has historically been patriarchal. I'm not saying it to be critical. I think I'm just being descriptive. Men have generally ruled American society. Family structures have generally been traditional. I put traditional in quotes because if you study the history of the family, there's no such thing as a traditional family, but at the very least, in this context, by traditional, like man at the top, woman underneath, and kids under that, right? A kind of hierarchy, right? Going back to the medieval era, there's still some hierarchy coming with us. Whoops. Chastity, no premarital sex, especially for women. We have debates in our society over gender and sexuality or abortion or whatever. Well, why? Well, because traditional views of chastity are at the center of WASP ideology. Hard work, right? Self-reliance and hard work, I think, really go together. If you work hard, you make it. Capitalism is a core part of WASP ideology, and unfortunately, white supremacy. Now, again, you look down this list, some of these you're probably okay with, some of them you're not. But regardless of whether you're okay with all of them or none of them, or a few of them, this is really the core ideology that founded this country, right? For better or for worse. And I want to spend a little bit more time with white supremacy, because I think most of us, when we hear white supremacy, we just think of like the Ku Klux Klan. But I think white supremacy is a much more pervasive ideology. And I think, I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble here, there's a lot of white people who have white supremacist ideologies, even though they don't know that they do. So let me just broadly define what I mean when I say white supremacy. So white supremacy is the belief that people of Western European descent are inherently superior and should dominate society. There are lots of people who would never say this, but their words and their actions show that they sort of believe it, right? So in its most extreme forms, and this is definitely not most Americans, in its most extreme forms, white supremacy has fueled racist violence, systemic oppression, and political suppression of non-whites. So that's kind of, again, when we think of white supremacy, we think of Jim Crow, we think of the KKK, right? We think of really, really, really kind of like brutal, awful things. However, there's a softer form of white supremacy that I think still very much shapes our discourses today. In softer forms, the ideology views the cultural, political, and aesthetic contributions of non-white folks as inherently inferior, right? So, for example, when I was growing up, I thought, music that had like a heavy rhythm that was kind of more black descended was inferior to music that was more melodic, that was from kind of white history and culture and society. I didn't know that was a white supremacist belief, but now in retrospect, I would say it was. Why? Because it assumes that like my culture is superior, this other culture is inferior. Well, this seems kind of in the past. Like, yeah, there has been a resurgent white supremacist movement for the past few years under Trump. But for the most part, most Americans are not walking around with like white supremacist paraphernalia. But again, one of our goals in this class is to see how these old ideas still stick around in very surprising ways. For example, I'm going to play you a video in a second. This video is about a caucus that was announced and then canceled as part of the U.S. Congress. So a caucus is basically a bunch of senators and representatives who all care about a particular issue or see things the same way.
There are 300 caucuses, or as they're officially known, congressional member organizations.
These members are on 7, 10, 12 caucuses.
Or more than that. I think the average in the last Congress was around 30 for House members.
Catherine Pearson studies U.S. Congress at the U.
The activities of caucuses vary tremendously. Some meet quite regularly, some strategize about how to make a real policy impact.
And they're just groups that have certain ways of looking at things.
And some really just focus on getting publicity for one particular issue.
They have to register with the House of Representatives, and they can't have dedicated staff or office space.
You have everything from caucuses that focus on asthma to rural issues to veterans.
A delegation from the Congressional Black Caucus.
The Congressional Hispanic Caucus.
Or the House Freedom Caucus, which has about 36 conservative Republican members.
But a few years ago, an announcement was made of a new caucus being formed, which never ended up happening, that felt eerily similar, kind of echoing some of these overt white supremacist stances that I'm kind of talking about right now. All right, check this out.
Tonight, a group of far-right Republicans in D.C. are reportedly pushing for a new congressional caucus to protect their words, Anglo-Saxon political traditions.
Well, some of the members associated with this new group are known for promoting baseless conspiracy theories, including our own Congressman Paul Gosar. Dennis Welch is here now with more on what this is all about. Dennis?
Yeah, and you got to remember that this is a group is proposing to call itself the America First Caucus. You can see this is likely a play off of former President Donald Trump's old campaign slogan. Now, his group, Punchbowl News, they were the ones that first broke this story, and they published those documents that lay out this group's Anglo-centric vision. It's a 7-page statement that includes the logo and says, in part, America is a nation with a border and a culture strengthened by a common respect for uniquely Anglo-Saxon political traditions. Further down, the America First Caucus writes that it will work towards an infrastructure that reflects the architectural, engineering, and aesthetic value that benefits the progeny of European architecture. We reached out to Gosar's office for comment, but a spokeswoman for the congressman replied via text message, "We are not going to comment on this story."
Now, that was just kind of one obscure example, but if you think about it more broadly, a lot of our conflicts that have been happening over the past few years really come down to disagreements over WASPism, right? The Black Lives Matter movement, regardless how you might feel about it, what was that? Well, it was a conflict over who should be kind of at the center of the cultural story, right? You look at how a lot of more conservative states have banned things like children attending drag shows. Well, what is that about? Well, it's a kind of waspish argument over gender and sexuality, right? That's not how we've always done it. Our traditional values have been this, and these new things are a threat to that. Here is some interesting data. This is a few years old, but still relevant. Poll reveals white Americans see an increase in discrimination against other white people and less against other groups. So there's been a ton of data on this for the past few years, particularly during the kind of late Obama years and into the Trump years. A lot of white Americans view themselves as an oppressed minority. Now, if you're an oppressed minority, you might think that's absurd, but regardless of how you feel about it, I think that's an example of how cultural conflicts today really come back to this question of who should be at the center of U.S. society, right? The people who founded it or the people who struggled to get there. And then also gerrymandering. If you don't know what gerrymandering is, we're going to deal with it at the end of class, but basically gerrymandering is a situation in which state legislatures redraw election maps to make it more favorable to their party. And a lot of what is motivating gerrymander, particularly from kind of more conservative circles, and it's happening on both sides, but the more conservative gerrymanders are often motivated by race to reduce the impact of black votes and make white votes more powerful. And that is happening right now, which again, if you don't believe me, we'll end the class talking about it. So the point is this. WASPism is a huge kind of like ideological structure that has shaped this country. It was there at the founding. It shaped our founding documents. And so many debates that we get over today really come back to debates over what values were established at the founding and should we move away from them or not, right? Okay, this pretty much brings us to the end of part 1. And what I want to do here is pause and have you do a reflection activity because I just threw a lot at you, right? So here's what I want you to do. So far, we've looked at some key pieces of the intellectual context that shaped the founders of the future United States of America. And here are some of them, right? We looked at modernity very broadly, the Enlightenment, natural rights philosophy, which was a kind of argument of the Enlightenment that was particularly important to the founders, and WASPism, white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. So choose one or two of those and write a line of word post identifying one or two ways that the ideas put forward during this era still shape our world today. So again, what is the goal of this lecture? One of them is to understand where the founders came from and understanding how things that happened centuries ago still shape us. So choose one of these: modernity, the Enlightenment, natural rights philosophy, and WASPism. Pick some current issue or thing happening in American society or some opinion that you have about American society and figure out one to two ways that one or more of these ideas are still shaping us, even though they're very old and happened a long time ago. I'm going to pause here. I'm looking forward to reading your responses. Okay, let me just recap where we've been before we jump into the next part. So we're looking at the founders. We started with Thomas Paine as a case study, right? The guy who made American cool and how his life really kind of like reflected the context the founders were in. What was that context? What was modernity, the Enlightenment, the birth of human rights? We also look at WASPism, like white supremacy, unfortunately being a core feature of the founding of this country. And for the second half, we're going to actually look at some of the founding documents a bit. And we're going to ask, how did these ideas shape very, very, very specific things, right? So we're going to spend some time with the founding documents, and we're going to do 2 case studies. And again, the ultimate goal is to understand how the past still shapes us, right? How stuff that happened centuries ago, again, whether you love the founders, whether you hate them, or somewhere in between, their ideas matter, and they still shape us, and they still shape arguments over American identity. So again, that is the ultimate goal of today's class. And for the second half, we're going to be using the founding documents to kind of look at that. So I just wanted to briefly pause here and, acknowledge that hopefully you've done the second talkback, which was a little different. It was an activity where you just kind of freely read through the Constitution and the amendments, if you made it that far, and just commented. What surprised you, what fascinated you, what infuriated you, what confused you. I hope that was interesting. This class is not about the Constitution, so I can't go back and answer every question or insight that you had, but I really enjoyed reading what you wrote. We'll continue to read those because I'm recording this while there's the answers still coming in. So I hope that was interesting, and hopefully it kind of set you up to do this, to really kind of like re-examine the Constitution, something I'm sure all of us have dealt with at some point in some kind of classroom in our lives, and try to look at it with fresh eyes through this lens of the larger context and how it shapes us today. So here is my second big idea for this lecture. The Constitution is a big ass deal. You cannot answer the question, what is an American, without starting with this founding document. So many current issues, from racial divides to the health of our democracy, make no sense without understanding the Constitution. Now, I will say, by saying we should understand the Constitution as it was originally written, I'm not arguing that we should apply the Constitution as it was written, right? People debate and disagree and argue over how the Constitution applies today. What I am just saying as a historian is, regardless of how we use it, we need to understand it in its context. And for the second part, we need to understand how things like from racial divides to the health of our democracy are still impacted by the Constitution. So those are going to be 2 case studies. We're going to look at that at the end of class. Jump in. I'm not going to talk about the Revolutionary War. It's something you can learn about on your own time if you're more interested in it. But long story short, we fought a revolution, we won. And this painting on the right is really fascinating. This is a painting of the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris was it was brokered by the French, the treaty that we signed with England to end military conflict in 1783. This is the only known painting of it, and the painting was never finished, which feels like really strangely metaphorical. I'll let you figure out what I mean by that. So right after that, the young United States had to figure out how to work together, right? And they tried something called the Articles of Confederation, something which in retrospect is considered a kind of a massive failure. So again, this is not important for your notes. I'm just giving you context because this sets up the Constitution. So after the Revolution, the states viewed themselves as separate countries, not as a unified nation. So yeah, Thomas Paine had done this whole American thing and created more of a sense of unity. But after the Revolution, people kind of went back to thinking like, my country is Maryland, my country is Virginia. They didn't really see themselves as a unified nation. However, they'd all fought this revolution together, and they realized they had to work together sometimes. So they created something called the Articles of Confederation to kind of broker or manage the relationships amongst the states. Right, so their shared revolutionary heritage and physical proximity demanded a cooperative agreement, much more brief way of saying it than what I just said, and they ratified the Articles of Confederation in 1777. The Confederation, however, didn't provide for federal taxation, foreign trade and treaties, a national military, or executive leadership. It was a mess. So that's a bit of an opinion on my point. I'm trying to be opinionated, but most historians agree it was kind of a mess. They were still trying to basically exist like 13 separate countries, and it didn't work. So essentially, a bunch of the states got together and said, hey, we need to fix this arrangement. There was even some fears there was going to be another revolution, right? Because they just fought this revolution. There's still revolutionary ferment going around, and some people were really unhappy with how things were. So what essentially happens is in 1787, delegates from each state meet in Philadelphia to fix the articles. I don't know if people realize this, but what ended up creating the Constitution, they weren't supposed to be doing the Constitution. They're supposed to be fixing something old, not creating something new. But after 4 months, they were like, surprise, we came up with a totally new government instead. And I'm kind of being sarcastic, but this is kind of what happened. They were like, hey, guys, we have something better. And people were a little surprised and didn't want it at first. But after adding a Bill of Rights, which wasn't originally there, enough states ratified it and a new nation was born. We are not going to look at the Constitution in depth. I'm just going to make some very, very broad generalizations about it and look at 2 specific important issues dealt with in different parts of the Constitution. However, I will say that we are going to be going back to the founding documents quite a lot, because again, so much what we fight over started here. So I think it's important just to begin with some very, very broad generalizations and kind of observations, almost like rules of engagement with the Constitution, particularly given its age, right? It was written in a different period than what we live in now. So here are just some guiding principles. And again, I do think this is so important, you should write this down in your notes. Guiding principle number one, realize that anytime you're specifically reading the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, they did not apply to the states initially. This didn't happen until the 14th Amendment. And you're like, this sounds like kind of a boring piece of trivia, but it becomes really important, right? So for example, some of our most cherished, First Amendment rights in particular, right to assemble, free speech, religion, those are only applied to the federal government, not the state governments initially. And this becomes really important in a week or two. So just kind of pin that as a background thought, but that is important to understand. The documents are often ambiguous. So some people don't like this. It might be offending some people if you're like a hardcore, I love the founding documents. But guess what? They're ambiguous. They mean, they say things that we don't know what they always mean unless we do the work to understand what they mean, right? So crucial terms that we fight over, like establishment of religion, and bear arms, were not defined in the text, right? You cannot read the Constitution and be told what these words mean. Interpreting some basic terms requires historical research to reconstruct their original meaning, right? And in general, if you want to know what these words mean, I tend to trust historians more than people like lawyers or or just, people who don't really study history, but just want the founders to, back up their opinions. There's a lot of opinions about what the founders mean, but you have to go back to the original words if you really want to understand it. Additionally, and these are facts, you can Google these, I'm not making these up. The founders almost immediately disagreed over what their own documents meant. Holding up one founder's view as the view is wrong-headed. Now, how can I know this? Well, because they wrote a lot, because we know they disagreed. We have written back and forth letters and arguments about what they actually meant. The so much language in the founding documents are ambiguous. I think that was intentional because they wanted people to work out and figure out what they meant themselves. And the founders had different ideas, right? So sometimes people will say, we need to understand the Constitution as it was originally written. That's really hard because some aspects of the Constitution don't have one original meaning. They have a lot of debated meanings that you need to sift through, right? Also, related to that, the founders held diverse viewpoints. They didn't all think the same thing. You should be skeptical of folks who pull quotes from various founders to prove their interpretation. Let me give you an example. I found some memes online. There's lots of quote memes out there. And oftentimes people will quote various famous people from history to prove certain perspectives. For example, let's say we pull this quote from John Adams. We recognize no sovereign but God and no king but Jesus. John Adams, second president of the United States, by the way. And sometimes people will pull quotes like this and say, see, I told you all the founders were Christians and they all believed in Jesus. And, crazy secular liberals are trying to tell us that they didn't. Oh, wait, here's another quote from John Adams. This would be the best of all possible worlds if there were no religion in it. Oh, wait, but he just said, wait, was he a Christian? Do you believe in Jesus? Yeah, okay, again, stop. Just stop. These are stupid debates. They're stupid debates because they don't understand context. These are two quotes made from John Adams, possibly at different times, possibly talking to totally different audiences, right? You can't just pull a quote out and say it proves something. You have to put it in its context, right? And a lot of people do this online. They'll want to say the Constitution means X, Y, and Z. They'll pull a quote from a founder and say, see, I told you this is the right perspective. Well, no, it may be the right perspective, it may not be. It may just be that particular perspective by that particular person at that particular time. You need context to understand what things mean. Final point. Americans in the New Republic vigorously and sometimes violently disagreed over what the founding documents meant. So why am I saying all this? Because again, a lot of people today have a lot of very strong opinions on social media or on TikTok or whatever. Like, I know what this means. This is what it means. All these other people are stupid, blah, blah, blah. I really want to take all that off the table and say, interpreting the Constitution is not an easy thing. It takes careful analysis. It takes reconstruction of the context. And a lot of times people will just use the Constitution or the Bill of Rights to beat other people over the head with. And that's not what I'm doing. And is the evidence for that. The founders disagree what they meant. People who lived under the Constitution disagree what it meant, right? We've always been fighting over what it means. So it's a little more complicated than that. And having said all that now, just made a lot of broad statements about how to interpret these documents. Hopefully I'll be modeling how to do this well for our first case study, which is citizenship and slavery in the Constitution. So basically I want to look at the Constitution's slavery clauses, tell you what they meant, tell you why they meant, again, how these were shaped and influenced by the Enlightenment, and how they still shape us today. So let's start with citizenship. So the Constitution does not directly spell out how one becomes a citizen. However, immediately in the earliest parts of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, is the second chunk of text in the Constitution, says this, under qualifications to be a congressman or representative, no person shall be a representative who shall not have attained to the age of 25 years old and been 7 years a citizen of the United States. Okay, so this is the first time citizenship is mentioned and it's not explained. So again, we have to do some digging and some context work. What does it mean to be a citizen? Well, it never really tells us, but we can infer based on some other things. So let's dig into this a little more. But first note this, right? Freedoms and fault lines. So this is a huge deal. Right off the bat, the Constitution did something no other document had, which was that it helped turn subjects, right, servants of the British Crown, into democratic citizens with the power to shape their own national government. There had been some democracies before, some societies where people could vote. However, in the American context, the number of people who could vote was a vast expansion over anything that had happened before, right? And just again, imagine being a British person your whole life, you're a citizen of the crown, the next day, excuse me, you're a subject of the crown, the next day you're a citizen of a democracy. That's a huge shift. And right off the bat, the Constitution, again, even if it doesn't spell out what a citizen or how you become a citizen, it at least acknowledges that we are something new, right? And this is going to be really, really, really important, right? And to this day, citizenship is something that people, especially who come to here from other countries, highly seek after. However, as we know, citizenship was definitely not for everybody. Citizenship was definitely for powerful white men. It was not for, as we're going to find out, it was not for women. It was not for Black folks. It was not for Native American folks. And all of that, again, this kind of WASPist belief in supremacy was directly reflected in our founding documents. And this is hardly surprising given the fact that many of the founders were slaveholders themselves. So this is I forgot to get a year on this. I think this happened during the Revolution before it ended. But Thomas Jefferson at one point had some slaves run away, enslaved folks run away, and this is again an advertisement, offering a reward for the runaways folks. And this is again reminding us that even though the founders were talking about equality, before the law, they weren't talking about everybody, right? So furthermore, it being the Constitution indirectly and racially identified citizenship, right? So it never comes out explicitly and said these people are citizens, these are not, but it infers it in Article 1, Section 2, which I'm going to look at in a second. Basically what it says, I'm going to show you the actual text, but I want to tell you what it says and show you the text. Native people who didn't assimilate, so in other words, it's Native Americans who did not become part of some kind of state or whatever, or society, kind of white society, and enslaved folks were not American. So where do we see that? Well, Article 1, Section 2, which is again in the same section we just saw, Clause 3 is talking about how we determine, for like taxation purposes and also for representation in Congress, how do we determine how many people are sent to Congress? Well, we do it based on population. How do we determine population? Well, let's read on. Representatives and direct taxes, shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers. In other words, representation and taxation is based on how many people are in each state, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons being non-enslaved persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, that means indentured servants, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. What does that mean? Well, Indians not taxed, again, this is Native Americans who had not joined white society. 3/5 of all other persons, what does that mean? That's enslaved folks. So for the purposes of counting population for taxation and congressional representation, Black folks were 3/5 of a person. What does that even mean? How did okay, so just table that. We'll come back to explain it in more detail. But the important thing is this: we're looking at this whole citizenship question. Here we find out that enslaved folks were not citizens. Free Black folks were in most states. And again, people bound to a service for a term of years, that means indentured servants, we'll talk about more at some other point. But just know that citizenship was basically tied to being white, right? Now, to ratify the Constitution, the founders had to get the southern states on board, so they had to compromise. So there were anti-slavery founders. For example, Ben Franklin was the leader of an abolitionist society. The anti-slavery and the pro-slavery founders could not agree. They almost basically walked away from the table completely. However, they compromised on slavery in order to have a country, and there are 3 sections. One we just mentioned, I'm going to come back to it and explain it better. But there are 3 sections where slavery is mentioned in the Constitution. However, it is never named directly, so you have to infer it. One section is Article 1, Section 9, where it basically says the foreign slave trade would automatically be outlawed in 1808. Let's read that and I'll explain it. So, This is under the legislative branch, powers denied to Congress, the migration or importation of such persons, as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person. What is that talking about? Basically what it's saying is this. In order to get, again, the pro-slavery, anti-slavery people on board, they had to compromise. The pro-slavery people wanted slavery forever, wanted the slave trade, the international, slave trade forever. The Constitution was ratified in 1787, so this basically gave slavers about 30 years to get their business in order to benefit from the slave trade until 1808. Why 1808? I don't know exactly. It was just considered a decent compromise. It's not too soon, it's not too late. The federal government can still tax from the slave trade, but they cannot prevent it until 1808. The second slave clause is in Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, which basically says that free states had to allow slaveholders to claim escaped slaves from other states. So this is known as the Fugitive Slave Code or Fugitive Slave Clause. And basically says this: a person charged in any, well, actually, just there's two parts of this. This is not directly about this, but it kind of sets it up. So let me read this. A person charged in any state with treason, felony, or other crime who shall flee from justice and be found in another state shall, on demand of the executive authority of the state from which he fled, be delivered up. So basically, if I commit a crime in Maryland, I run to Virginia, Virginia has to give me up if they find me. So the So the Fugitive Slave Clause is kind of based on this. So right after it says, no person held to service or labor in one state. Again, that's enslavement. Didn't want to come out and say it because it's too ugly, so they use euphemisms. Service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of party to whom such service or labor may be due. Again, it's really old English. Glad we don't talk this way anymore. Basically, what it's saying is, if you're an enslaved person in Virginia, you run away to New York, somebody finds you there, nobody in New York, local officials or authorities or just everyday citizens can prevent this free person from being recaptured and taken into enslavement. The third slave clause we've already seen, the 3/5 clause, and I do want to spend some time explaining it because it is really, really easy to misunderstand and it's really complicated. Enslaved people counted as 3/5 of a person for deciding congressional representation and taxation. So here it is again, and we're not going to read the whole thing. Let's just read this end part where it said 3/5 of all other persons. Basically, it's saying if you are an enslaved person, in terms of congressional representation, you're counted as 3/5 of a person. So here is an illustration of that. If you're a free person, you are counted singularly. If you're an enslaved person, you're counted as 3/5, right? So what is this about? So basically, this is a provision that was put in by anti-slavery people, believe it or not, because pro-slavery people wanted all of their enslaved population to count as one person when it came to the U.S. Census. Why? Well, because if you're counting people who are enslaved, it just makes you more powerful in Congress, and then you can influence more what Congress does. So anti-slavery people were like, no, you can't count them at all. Pro-slavery people came back and were like, well, we have to. Went back and forth, and they decided on 3/5 of a person. So it's a really ugly clause. And unfortunately, some people on the internet have championed it and said this was an anti-slavery clause. It's like, well, it's more complicated than that. You know what? Let me just pause here and play a video because I think this video does a really, really good chance of dealing with the kind of moral and ethical complexity of the 3/5 clause.
It's more than a little ironic that the place where the U.S. Constitution was drafted was later called Independence Hall. Because while it's true that the United States was effectively born there were millions of people who called the United States home who, in many ways, became even less free following the ratification of the Constitution. Now, this is not to imply that the colonial laws we've talked about in earlier episodes weren't restricting or inhumane in their own right. They were. But the Constitution, even in its earliest days when so many people around the world weren't really sure what a constitution even was intended as an effort to solidify the legal principles of a nation. In the United States, the Constitution is the central legal document of our land. It is the thing that everything else comes back to. And in our foundational legal document, the one upon which the legal and political landscape of this country would be built, the founders failed to do away with slavery. In fact, they recommitted to it. And there were many people who felt strongly that this was a moral indictment of the country. Almost 70 years later, in 1854, the famous abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison would hold up a copy of the U.S. Constitution and burn it, calling it a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. And it didn't have to be this way. The founders could have used this as an opportunity to say, hey, look, let's start this experiment fresh. They could have said, you know what, team? We inherited slavery from the British. We just fought a war of independence. And that means we should probably make everyone independent. But instead, the majority of them were like, nah. And the thing is, so many of them knew slavery was wrong. And so many of them knew that it was something they should be ashamed of. That's why the word slave didn't actually appear anywhere in the Constitution. They didn't want it anywhere on the document because they knew that it was something history would judge them for. This matters because it demonstrates what many founders of our nation valued and where they thought that black people should be on the social hierarchy. On an economic front, slavery was an incredibly lucrative business, and the founders knew that, many of them personally. Of the 55 delegates at the Constitutional Convention, about 25 owned enslaved people. This conflict manifested itself in two ways: the Three-Fifths Compromise and the Slave Trade Clause. Let's start with the Three-Fifths Compromise. Article 1 of the Constitution set up a government with two legislative chambers. In the Senate, each state gets 2 senators. But in the House of Representatives, representation is determined by the population of the state. And these newly minted states had very different compositions. Northern states were more densely populated with white citizens, while southern states were heavily populated with enslaved black people. What this did was create a dilemma. The colonists were unsure if and how they should acknowledge enslaved black people as members of the population and to what extent they should be counted as citizens in the context of allotting states political representation. Let's go to the thought bubble. Northern delegates did not support including enslaved black people in the population of the southern states, largely because it would give the South more political power. But the southern delegates knew they wouldn't be able to compete in the House of Representatives if enslaved people weren't counted. And this is where we get something called the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise was a clause in the Constitution that defined enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a human. It was placed in Article 1, Section 2, and it stated that representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. 3/5 of a person. That doesn't even make sense to say out loud. And it sounds absurd because it is absurd. Even though the South would have loved for black people to fully count for political purposes, this legislative compromise, which turned black people into fractions, came to serve as a larger metaphor for the way that black people were seen by many as less than human. The implications of this decision were profound. It changed the dynamics of the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. Without the Three-Fifths Compromise, some historians even argue that Thomas Jefferson would have never won the election of 1800. Thanks, Thought Bubble.
Now, when you put all this together, you might think, well, I'm really glad that's in the past. I'm really glad we don't use race as a marker to decide who's a citizen, who's not, who can vote, and who's not. And sure, that is mostly true. But there are some people who think that this is not in the past as much as you may think, and that to this day, we are still having basically racial fights over who can vote or not. Now, we're getting into territory where you might disagree with some of this commentary, and that's fine. But again, my goal today is to connect the past to the present, and I kind of want to make that case for people who believe that the past is still very much with us when it comes to this issue of race and voting. For example, over the past few years, a lot of states, in particular more conservative or right-leaning states, have passed laws kind of upping the requirements that one has to meet in order to vote in your state. According to the people who pass and support these laws, these are voter integrity laws, making the voting system more fair, making it less prone to fraud and things like that, right? Well, what is the root of these laws? Well, these laws really stem from some of the rhetoric that came out of the 2020 election. So quick refresher, I'm sure you all remember, January 6, 2020, Donald Trump disputed the results of the election that ended up with Joe Biden winning, and started a kind of national movement broadly known as Stop the Steal, right? The idea was the Democrats had plotted to steal the election from Donald Trump, and this was proof of widespread voter fraud, and this is why, particularly conservative states had to make their voting procedures tighter and more stringent to prevent this kind of fraud. Here's the problem, though, is that no one has ever produced any evidence to prove this. For example, the Heritage Foundation. Some of you might know the Heritage Foundation. They're very wealthy, very influential conservative think tank. Very, very conservative. And they have an online portal monitoring instances of voter fraud. And these are how many instances of voter fraud have been kind of tried and prosecuted over the past, I think it's like 60 years, leading us to conclude that voter fraud is very rare. The vast majority of the voter fraud that has happened before the 2020 election. The 2020 election did not have more voter fraud than other elections, actually had significantly less than some past elections. And to this day, there's absolutely no evidence that the 2020 election was stolen. Despite that, to this day, and this poll is pretty recent, 2023, poll after poll after poll shows that a vast majority of American Republicans believe the 2020 election was illegitimate and that it was stolen from Trump, right? So one has to ask then, if the 2020 election was not stolen, what is the purpose of all these voter integrity laws? Well, there is lots of evidence that there is some racial motivation here. There is a lot of evidence that, in particular, suppressing the votes of poor minorities living in urban areas is a big part of this agenda. And I think this video will help explain why some people think that.
What you're seeing in this country right now is a almost splitting of the voting system, where some states are making it much, much easier to vote, whereas other states are saying, like, we want to have much more stringent regulations. In 39 states, for instance, you've seen legislation proposed that would expand voter ID requirements. In 9, you've seen legislation proposed that would allow state legislatures to invalidate or change the electoral counts. The way that they reduced some of the wait times, for instance, that you're allowed to stand in line, or banning the passing out of snacks and water in line, those were particularly egregious policies that people had a strong reaction to. This has all been in reaction to a strong sentiment throughout the country, especially among the conservative base, that the election of 2020 was somehow illegitimate. So the proponents of these laws, who they call them election security laws, they are arguing that to preserve democratic legitimacy, we need to enact these laws to protect the sanctity of the ballot. Voting rights advocates are saying that that has it entirely backwards. And they're saying that these laws are going to restrict and are specifically targeted at ensuring that the result of the election goes the way that one party wants to in the future. But until we actually see how an election plays out with some of these laws in place, we're not going to know necessarily what the effects are going to be. What we've seen with these laws isn't necessarily that they are saying, no, we don't want minority communities to vote, or no, we don't want urbanites to vote. But the practical result of a situation where you say every county is only allowed to have a certain number of ballot drop boxes. For instance, I'm thinking right now of Maricopa County in Arizona or Fulton County in Georgia. If you reduce that number, you are effectively making it harder for urban Americans to vote. You've seen, for instance, cases where you're still allowed to register with a gun license, but you're not allowed to register with a student license. And that's something that voting rights advocates have been very much pushing on, and arguing that certain provisions in these laws, while they might not make it impossible for large swaths of the population to vote, a lot of elections in America are won on the margins. And if you make it harder for a marginal group of people to vote, then you can really transform the face of this country.
That video was a few years old and some of the data wasn't good. So here's a relatively more updated data. So this is showing voter turnout dropping in some states with restrictive voting laws. So this is looking at basically the 4 states that had some of the most restrictive voting laws put in, making voting harder, making more requirements one has to meet before one can vote. And we can see here between the 2018-2022 gubernatorial election, there was significantly lower voter turnout. Now, correlation does not always equal causation. I'm not saying that one directly led to the other, but there's a lot of evidence when you compile all the data that states that had more restrictive voting laws put into place, that fewer people voted, in particular fewer people of color, right? Because generally speaking, these laws, I think, are crafted in ways to particularly make it hard for lower income people who might not have access to government ID all the time, making it harder for them to vote. And, the results are debatable, but, I think there's a case to be made here. We're going in the opposite direction. This includes blue states, red states, and purple states are actually using some of the furor over the 2020 election to go in the opposite direction and make voting easier because they think more democracy is a good thing. So again, like most things in America, we're kind of moving in 2 directions at once. This, I think, shows that how even things that happen during the Constitution, this kind of argument over how citizenship and voting rights and race kind of all tie in together, are things that we're still kind of debating to this day. If you're not convinced by that case study, I think the second one is a bit more of a slam dunk case, which is federal elections and gerrymandering. So in this final section, basically what I'm going to do is look at the Constitution and notice how some things the Constitution says and doesn't says about elections basically left the door open for some kind of nefarious actors to mess with our election system. And even just on face value, some of the things the Constitution put forward, maybe they were great ideas at the time, but now we don't love them so much. So kind of final case study for how the ideas in the Constitution still shape us today. So the Constitution says a lot about electing and voting and things like that, but it never comes right out and says, who should vote when and how, right? Where are the procedures, what times and days and how long and all that stuff. The Constitution, I think, wisely left it vague so that states could figure it out for themselves. And here are some examples of that. Article 1, Section 2, the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. So long story short, and I'm assuming you know this, but if you don't, we have Congress, right? There's the two houses of Congress, the Senate, the representatives. Each state gets 2 for the Senate. Each state gets set a different number based on their population. So the more populous states have more representatives, right? And basically what this is saying is everyday people will vote for these people. That's all it says. This will vote for them. It doesn't say, or they'll elect them. It doesn't say how, right? Right after that, it says the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature. I don't know if people realize that, but it was not until the 1920s, during the Progressive Era, which we'll talk about at some point, that a reform was put in place so that everyday citizens voted for senators. So we didn't vote for senators until the early 20th century, till about 100 years ago. The times, now here's the important part, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, right? So in other words, Congress is not going to tell you how to do this. We want you to figure this out. But there's a balance here. The Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators. So in other words, the states can figure out what to do, but if the states go a little too far violating the Constitution, the Congress can step in and kind of address it, right? Here's the thing. The Constitution basically tells states you can decide how you run elections and who votes in them, right? So I think what would be cool to see is a really, really brief overview of what we call the franchise. The franchise is basically giving a particular group a right to vote. And that has changed over time, which again, the Constitution didn't dictate, so we shouldn't be surprised that it changed over time. So in early America, voting was largely restricted to propertied white men. By the 1800s, property requirements have been dropped. And again, we have this federalism thing, so depending on what state you were in, the requirements changed by state. In fact, for a brief period, state of New Jersey allowed women to vote. That was maybe a few decades, didn't last very long. But again, each state had their own thing. However, by the time we get to the 1800s, pretty much white men universally were able to vote, which was a huge deal at the time. Again, had not really been done before in human history. No major changes made to the franchise until after the Civil War. The 15th Amendment, which is one of the Civil War amendments that the Northern Congress passed to kind of keep the South from coming back to power. The 15th Amendment extends the franchise to all male citizens, regardless of race. However, the South creates myriad ways to keep Black men from voting. And I'm sure you probably broadly know that history. We're going to come back to it here and there. 1920, the 19th Amendment extends the franchise to women. So again, about 100 years ago. 1965, during the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act outlaws a variety of racist practices aimed at keeping Southern Black folks from voting. So we see all throughout history, it's almost like this expansion, right? We're kind of delineating the boundaries and we're moving the boundaries out to allow more and more people access until somewhat recently in 2013, so SCOTUS is the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court guts key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. In particular, there are provisions saying that these particular states that had practiced racist intimidation in the past had to submit rules to Congress whenever they changed voting rules. That was gutted in 2013. So the kind of a contraction, although if you're more conservative people, you would also see that as an expansion because it's getting the government out of things more and allowing the states to decide for themselves. So overall, what we see is that the Constitution didn't say who could vote, and we changed that over time, which I think is interesting. However, I think we need to look at one more part of the Constitution to kind of pivot towards some of the issues that we still fight over today. Article 2 is about the office of the presidency. This is how to pick the president. Okay. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct. Remember, each state has its own legislature, right? So each legislature is deciding a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. but no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit of the United States shall be appointed an elector. So what does this mean? This is how we pick the president. Believe it or not, we don't vote for president of the United States. We participate in something called the Electoral College, right? Why do we use the Electoral College? Well, because it's in the Constitution. We haven't changed it, even though a lot of people think we should. Here's a little video about the Electoral College, just because, again, I realize for a lot of you this is a review and you might be rolling your eyes. Familiarize yourself with this concept. So let me just play this mini video and then I'll talk a little bit about it after.
If you watch the news during a presidential election, you'll hear a lot of this.
What do the national polls look like?
Hillary Clinton's national lead. Nationally, Joe Biden is currently ahead.
But these national polls don't actually tell you who's going to win.
Throw the national polls out the window. They don't matter at all. What matters are those swing states.
Ah, yes, the swing states. Most democracies around the world elect their head of state with a popular vote, so whoever gets the most votes wins. But in America, we do it a little differently. The US is the only country that picks its president using something called the Electoral College. It's made up of delegates from each US state. When Americans vote for president, what they're actually voting for is who their state will vote for. This is why, every so often, someone wins the presidency without winning the popular vote. That's happened twice in just the past 20 years. The majority of Americans do not like the system, and haven't for a long time. Both political parties have made attempts to get rid of it. So why does the US still use the Electoral College? And who actually benefits from it? The Electoral College is based on how people are represented in Congress, where each state has a number of representatives based on its population, and every state also gets 2 senators. So, for example, let's look at Texas, which has a huge population, and Vermont, which has a really small one. Texas has 36 representatives in Congress. Vermont only gets 1. Representatives in both states each represent roughly the same number of people. In the Electoral College, a state gets the same number of delegates as their congressional representatives, plus 2 for each senator. So Texas has 38 electoral votes, Vermont has 3. But this combination makes the number of people each delegate represents way different between states. In Texas, 1 electoral delegate represents 3 times the amount of people as 1 in Vermont. And that makes each individual person's vote in Vermont a lot more influential. The Electoral College creates discrepancies like this all over the country. A voter in Wyoming is worth 3.5 times as much as a voter in California. And the winner of the presidential election is the candidate who gets 270 or more of these Electoral College votes. These are the results of the 2016 election by state. You're probably more familiar with this version of it, a map of red states and blue states. But this chart tells a different story. You can see that no state is actually all red or all blue. But almost every state awards its electoral votes the same way. The candidate who gets the most votes in a state gets all its electoral votes. If they win the state by 1%, they win 100% of the electoral votes. In 2016, more than 4 million people voted for Donald Trump in California. In fact, more people voted for him there than in any other state except for 2. But it didn't matter. Hillary Clinton got more votes there, so she got all 55 of its electoral votes. Clinton never even campaigned in California. Polling showed she'd easily win the state. Trump only visited Texas once. He knew he'd basically had that state's electoral votes locked. But they both visited Florida 35 or more times. That's because Florida is usually a swing state. Polls show that the vote there could swing to one party or another nearly every election. Trump only won it in 2016 by 100,000 votes, out of more than 9 million. Swing states have changed over time thanks to shifting demographics and political views, and it's states like these where presidential candidates spend most of their time campaigning. It also means these states have way more influence over the election than these ones. A study found that voters in Michigan had 51 times the amount of influence on the 2016 election as someone from a state like Utah. Voters in states like California or Missouri mattered very little. Swing states are where the election actually takes place. They get the attention and the influence, and they only exist because of the Electoral College. It doesn't seem very fair, but the Electoral College has always shifted power away from some people and towards others. It was how it was designed. Back when there were just a few states, not 50, they had to get all the states to agree on the Constitution. One problem. The northern states, which were largely anti-slavery, wanted only free people to count in the population towards electoral votes, which they had more of. The pro-slavery southern states were worried that they would be constantly outvoted and wanted enslaved people to count in determining the population. As a compromise, they settled on something called the Three-Fifths Clause. It established that an enslaved person would only count as 3/5 of a person. In 1800, Pennsylvania, a northern state, and Virginia, a southern one, had about the same number of free people living there. But Virginia was also home to hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who had no freedom, let alone a vote, and ended up with more votes in the Electoral College than Pennsylvania. That year, those extra electoral votes gave the candidate from Virginia just enough to win. Even after the U.S. finally abolished slavery and eventually gave Black Americans the right to vote, white Southern leaders found ways to keep them from voting, like with discriminating laws like poll taxes and acts of violence. This meant they continued to have overrepresentation in the Electoral College on behalf of a large population that couldn't vote. The first time Congress attempted to replace the Electoral College with a simple popular vote was back in 1816. But senators from southern states blocked it, saying it would be deeply injurious to them. In 1969, Congress came even closer. Replacing the Electoral College had support in both parties, and even passed the House, but it was blocked again by southern senators. A senator from Alabama wrote, "The Electoral College is one of the South's few remaining political safeguards. Let's keep it. Why change a system that historically had, and still was, benefiting white Southerners?" Today, the states that the Electoral College benefits have changed, but it's still making some voters more powerful than others. If we look at the states with a lot of electoral votes for not a lot of people, and the states with a little electoral votes for a lot of people, these states are a lot wider and less diverse than the rest of America. And many of these states are Republican strongholds. These tend to vote Democratic. That's one reason the two most recent Republican presidents have won the Electoral College without winning the popular vote. And since it's currently Democrats that are primarily disadvantaged by the Electoral College, they're the ones leading the charge to replace it with a popular vote.
Get rid of the Electoral College and everybody.
But as politics have changed, the people most critical of the Electoral College have too. In the 1948 presidential election, New York ended up being the major swing state. A congressman from Texas said, "I have no objection to the Negro in Harlem voting, but I do resent the fact that his vote is worth 100 times as much as the vote of a white man in Texas." Swing states change. What doesn't is that the Electoral College gives certain people more power to pick the president. And its biggest defenders have always been those who benefit the most from it.
Okay, so here's the Electoral College map for our most recent election. So essentially, each state has a certain number of votes. A few states split them, Nebraska and Maine, coincidentally some of the smaller states, so it's probably the least consequential, split them. All the other states are winner take all. So when someone runs for president, they're not running to get the most votes, they're running to get the most Electoral College votes, right? And again, I'm using this as an example because the founders gave us something really great, but they also gave us something really problematic that we still fight over. So from here, I want to pivot a bit and talk about some of the issues that the Constitution gives us. So quick refresher, federalism, right? It's the core governmental structure underlying the Constitution, and it is a system in which power is shared between national and local governments. Okay, so again, the founders wanted to balance power. They didn't want the states or the federal government to have too much power. So some aspects of elections, the federal government figures out, other aspects the states figure out. This seems like a good way to balance it, right? However, the founders were not psychic. They couldn't see what would happen. And today, we recognize that also set up unforeseen advantages and disadvantages built into the system that some today view as harmful to U.S. democracy, right? So again, it's some of the decisions that were made maybe made sense at the time, but they still shape us. Additionally, it also left the specifics of elections, including procedures and who could vote, up to the states, right? So what happens when you entrust politicians with broad control of their own elections while bad things happen? That's kind of like the next part we're going to be looking at. The founders were really smart guys. They did the best they could, but some of what they wrote is still creating problems for us today. So let's look at some of those. One of those is known as the swing state advantage. So certain states have outsized power in national elections. For example, in this, here we see some yellow and really, really important purple state, Michigan. President candidates tend to ignore reliably blue or reliably red states and focus on states that could swing either way. So, for example, living in Maryland, Maryland, at least now, is reliably a blue state. It has almost always goes for, the Democratic candidate in national elections. So, national candidates have very little incentive to come to Maryland, whereas states like Florida, states like Texas, states like Michigan, they can go either way. So they're going to spend a lot of their time campaigning there, right? Why? Well, because they're not campaigning for the whole country to vote for them. They're campaigning for the Electoral College to hand them a victory. So another kind of issue is that the Electoral College is winner take all in most states, again, except for those two. And a presidential candidate can win the Electoral College while losing the popular vote, meaning fewer Americans wanted them. And this has happened 5 times, most recently with these folks, right? So again, 5 times throughout history, the presidential candidate who got the most votes did not win the presidency. Why? Well, because of the Electoral College. Why do we have the Electoral College? Well, again, it comes back to race. We have the Electoral College because when the founders were trying to compromise between anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces, the Electoral College system seemed like a good way to balance the interests of the South versus the interests of the North. And again, there's a lot more history behind there. But again, it kind of illustrates the point, right? These ideas of like WASPism and natural rights, trying to put all these things together into a founding document, they came together in ways that we're still kind of fighting over today. But at the end of the day, one of the most significant, and one may even say egregious, kind of constitutional loopholes in our voting system, which again, the founders never could have foreseen, is something known as gerrymandering. And this is our last topic of the day. So let's explore this and see what this is about. So what is gerrymandering? Let me just define it first. Gerrymandering is a process in which partisan state legislatures, so by partisan, I mean they're deeply tied to their political party, whether it's Republicans or Democrats in our context. Partisan state legislatures redraw congressional representation maps to benefit their party. So again, we saw with the Constitution, there's concern of figuring out how many people we have so we can figure out how much representation there is. And people over the years have figured out, well, someone has to draw these maps and figure out, what sections are being represented by what person in Congress. So let's mess with the maps, right? This is a really weird word. Where did this came from? This word came from this guy. This is Elbridge Gerry. He was the governor of Massachusetts, a Democrat, a governor of Massachusetts in the early 1800s. And he wanted to keep his party in power. So here's what he realized, that according to the Constitution basically leaves it up to the states to figure out kind of the means and the ends and the processes for deciding how and where and why and who can vote. And one of the ways they do that is by using representation maps, right? So they draw maps and they say, okay, all these people are in this district and they're represented by this person, and all these people are in this district. And early on, political parties realized, aha, we could draw maps in such a ways that keep our parties in power, right? Either concentrating people that will vote for us in one area or kind of diluting people who won't vote for us in other areas. And that's what we see here. So this weird kind of dragon looking thing, a lot of people thought that this is a shape on a map that was drawn, basically put a bunch of people who are not voting for their party in one big district to kind of dilute their power. And a lot of people thought that this weird shape looked like a salamander, which I don't think it looks like a salamander, but back then people did. A salamander is kind of like an amphibious, a reptile-like amphibian. And eventually the name gerrymander, combining Jerry with salamander, stuck. And anytime anyone redraws a congressional map to benefit their party and to disadvantage another party, it is known as a gerrymander, right? So again, here's just the notes for that. Origin, 1800s, Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry helped redraw a map that benefited his party. Folks thought that one district looked like a salamander and invented the satirical word gerrymander to describe it. So this word has way outlived this man or his influence, but it is what it is. So how does gerrymandering work? What happens 2 main ways. One way is packing. So in packing, you pack as many voters for the opposition party into a small number of districts. And this essentially dilutes their votes, right? So you're drawing up the maps. This region represents this person, that region, that. Well, let's put all the people who aren't going to vote for us in one region so their votes aren't as powerful. That's packing, right? You're putting all into one. The other is cracking. This is when you take a district dominated by opposition party voters and crack it into pieces. So for example, Baltimore City is primarily blue. If I was a red person trying to gerrymander a map, it might split Baltimore City into a bunch of other red districts so that their votes were diluted, right? This basically nullifies votes by connecting these pieces to districts with the majority of your voters. If this isn't making sense, I'm going to play a video that will explain it a little bit. And also this video will give you some of the overview of how gerrymandering has been used within the past 50 or 60 years and how it shapes current politics as well. Check it out.
In 2018, Americans voted for who would represent them in Congress. But in North Carolina, the election results were really weird. These squares represent all the voters in North Carolina. They were voting for these 13 seats in Congress. About half voted for Republicans, and about 48% voted for Democrats. So you might think of the 13 congressional seats, maybe Democrats would have won 6 seats, and Republicans would have won 7. But no, Democrats only won 3 of 13 seats, way less than half. This imbalance was because North Carolina's congressional districts had been gerrymandered. It means that these voters had been grouped into districts very strategically with the goal of benefiting one party. Gerrymandering has pretty much always happened in America. That's because every 10 years, the political districts are redrawn. And in most cases, those new lines get drawn by whoever holds power in state government at the time. That's what happened in 2010. Republicans won control of lots of state governments and redrew the political lines to favor themselves. And over the next few years, redistricting helped them hold on to almost all those states. This shifted the balance of power. And it turns out behind a lot of this was one guy.
Usually the voters get to pick the politicians. In redistricting, the politicians get to pick the voters.
This is Thomas Hofeller, the mapmaker who helped Republicans gerrymander districts over the last decade. When Hofeller died in 2018, his daughter found thousands of his emails and files, which she shared with activists. The files show that Tom Hofeller's fingerprints are all over the way America's political maps look today. But North Carolina was his masterpiece. And if you want to understand why gerrymandering is such a big problem in the US, that's a good place to start. The basics of gerrymandering are actually pretty simple. If you're a Republican trying to keep power, you want to do 2 things. First, pack as many Democratic voters as possible into a single district. If you have a district where almost everyone votes Democrat, that means almost half these votes are basically wasted. You can also crack big Democratic areas into separate districts where there are slightly more Republicans. So even though an area has a lot of Democratic votes, they would actually lose in this district and in this district. These are the 2 elements of classic gerrymandering, packing and cracking. And Hofeller employed these techniques masterfully in North Carolina. In 2011, he was hired to redraw the state's political lines, and for congressional districts, he came up with this map. Now I just want to focus in on District 12, this weird skinny shape. In order to make sense of this shape, we have to look at another map. This map shows the percentage of black people in each neighborhood. The bluer areas are where more black people live. Hofeller basically gathered up black people in Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and Charlotte and packed them into one district. So that's how District 12 happened. Hofeller also did this with North Carolina state representatives and state senators. For example, here are the state senate districts. Here, he packed Winston-Salem into one district, and then packed Greensboro into its own district. These new districts helped Republicans get a stranglehold on power in the North Carolina State House. And over the next few years, they were able to pass crucial legislation.
A strict new voter ID law in North Carolina.
Which bathrooms transgender individuals can use in North Carolina.
In 2016 and 2017, federal courts ruled that both of these maps were unconstitutional. They said what North Carolina Republicans did wasn't just gerrymandering, it was racial gerrymandering, done to deliberately dilute the political power of black people. The court said the Republicans in the North Carolina State House now had to redraw the lines without looking at racial demographics. So, they went back to Tom Hofeller. This time, Hofeller couldn't look at race. Instead, he looked at which areas voted for Democrats and which areas voted for Republicans. Instead of a racial gerrymander, it would be a partisan gerrymander. Here's that map, using data from 2014. The bluer an area, the more Democratic voters there are. Now, if you zoom in here to Greensboro, you can see one of the highest concentrations of Democratic voters in the state. Hofeller drew a congressional district line to crack this community in half. This meant Democrats here were now in the minority in their district, and Democrats here were also in the minority in their district. Hofeller employed these techniques all over the state to create North Carolina's new political districts. And the first big test for these new maps would be the 2018 election. Democrats were expected to turn out in droves.
Democrats are vying for a potential blue wave.
The wave that Republicans fear is going to wipe them out.
So, how did the maps do? For state representatives, Democrats got 51% of the vote. They only won 46% of seats. For state senate, they received half the vote and won just 42% of seats. And for Congress, you already know how that one turned out. Democrats won nearly half the votes, but won only 3 out of 13 seats. A year later in 2019, the Supreme Court weighed in. They said it was beyond their reach, that it wasn't their job to fix it. All of this raised an existential question. If Republicans could continue drawing the lines to stay in power, how could they ever be elected out of office? But the Supreme Court's ruling left open the possibility for state courts to rule on partisan gerrymandering. And in September 2019, that's exactly what North Carolina's Supreme Court did. The court found that partisan gerrymandering violated the state constitution. In the court's decision, it was Hofeller's files that helped prove that North Carolina Republicans drew these lines with the clear intention of benefiting themselves. Ultimately, the court said North Carolina Republicans had to redraw the state House and state Senate maps one more time. This new map, approved by North Carolina legislators, is much less biased toward one party, even though it took some extreme measures and nearly a decade to force politicians to draw a fair map. In the last few years, the courts in several states, like Florida and Pennsylvania, have made partisan gerrymandering much harder. And now that's also the case in North Carolina. Hofeller is gone now. But in other states across the country, many maps he helped draw are still in use. And while there's now a clearer strategy to challenge those maps in state courts, many voters are still effectively not choosing their representatives. It's like Hofeller said, the representatives are choosing the voters.
Of course, redistricting is democracy at work. Redistricting is like an election in reverse. It's a great event.
Now, I don't care what your political party is, but I hope that video infuriated you. If you care about democracy, you should hate gerrymandering, regardless of your party. Okay, just to bring us up to speed, here is a map. By the way, this is kept up by, there's something called the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. It's basically a political science project that Princeton University sponsors to kind of keep track of gerrymandering across the country. These are the top 10 most gerrymandered states. And we see here both parties are doing it. Take North Carolina. North Carolina is a heavily gerrymandered state, which has been gerrymandered by the Republican Party. Maryland is also a heavily gerrymandered state, gerrymandered by the Democratic Party. However, again, just to be fair, not trying to take sides, on one hand, we could say both parties are doing it. On the other hand, this is much more prolifically being pursued by the Republican Party. So the top 10 worst gerrymandered states, 9 of them are Republican gerrymanders, and one of them is a Democratic gerrymander. So yes, both parties are doing it, but one party is doing it more. I'll leave the implications of that statement up to you, but that is just a fact. And again, I think the video did a good job of saying that there were racial roots to this, right? Initially, when gerrymandering took off in the 80s and 90s, it was explicitly racial, right? Let's put a bunch of black voters into other districts so that their votes don't hurt us as much, right? And even recently, 2023, an Alabama judge rejected the map that the Republican-controlled Congress had submitted, basically saying that it diluted black voting powers.
Well, 3 federal judges in Alabama selected new congressional lines to represent the state in the 2024 election.
The decision ends a roughly 2-year legal battle and gives the state its second majority black voting district.
The new map shifts the boundaries of Alabama's 2nd congressional district to stretch across the state. The decision significantly increases Democrats' chances of flipping the district's House seat in next year's election.
Stephen Bisaha joins us now. He is a wealth and poverty reporter at the Gulf States newsroom. Welcome. Thanks for being with us. So this has been a long and contested process. How did we get here? How do these changes impact the congressional makeup of the state and the House of Representatives?
How we got here is, I mean, we're talking about the geography of the state, but really it comes down to the math, simple math. I mean, Alabama is more than a quarter black, yet out of the 7 congressional seats that we have here, only one was going to be majority black. So that's the map that Alabama lawmakers passed in 2021, Republican lawmakers. And quickly the state was sued by different groups that said, hey, this is not representative, this is not equal for black voters. So eventually these 3 federal judges said, yeah, we agree with this. Alabama, you need to add another district that is a black voter stronghold. The Supreme Court, perhaps surprisingly, actually backed up the 3 judges here, and then Alabama got a chance to draw this map as the Supreme Court ordered, made this 2nd district. Alabama ignored that. They made a map without that 2nd district. These 3 judges were not happy about this. That's why they said, okay, we are going to draw this map for you. And that's the map that we got yesterday.
So the big question is whether or not this will truly give black voters any more political power in the state, and whether or not it leads to any real significant changes.
Well, that was the thing, is they essentially assigned a special master to draw 3 maps for the judges to hear from. And then we had this whole process of going back, what's the best map here? Because this new district is not a majority black. It's like just under 50%. But then when they projected it out, looked at past elections, how would the black preferred candidate actually do, the candidate that got most votes from black voters in this district, they performed pretty well. They tended to dominate in this district. So this does mean we are likely to see a seat that is chosen by black voters now 2 instead of 1 out of the 7 congressional seats in Alabama, which also means that seat is almost certainly going to be flipping from red to blue, from Republican to Democrat.
Am I saying this is racially motivated? I don't know. I don't know the hearts and minds of the people who wrote these. But the point is this: the Constitution was written a long time ago. It was written with all these ideas, these great ideas about natural rights, and these really bad ideas about white supremacy. And in a lot of really complicated ways, we're still fighting over those, all the way down to like what our congressional maps look like, right? So these ideas and these views are still very much with us. So let's quickly review where we've been and then wrap up and end with an activity. We start with our case study, Thomas Paine as kind of a prototypical Enlightenment thinker. What does that even mean? Well, we explored it a little bit by looking at modernity, moving away from these medieval ideas, embracing them in something called the Enlightenment, which directly led to the creation of ideas that the founders held dear when they wrote the founding documents. But we also talked about the other side of this, right? How the founders also were, very committed white supremacists, and those shaped our founding documents as well. Then we looked a little bit at the founding documents and specifically looked at how the slavery clauses and the clauses around elections, how those ideas shaped those institutions and how those institutions were still kind of fighting over them today, and how a lot of the freedoms and fault lines the founders established were still kind of jockeying for power over their legacy. So hopefully I've done my job and proven to you 2 things. 1, the founders, regardless of how you personally feel about them, are really important to understand, that their ideas were really important and the context they came from was important. And 2, that, again, regardless of what you think of our founding documents, whether you think they're great or terrible, that they're really, really, really important, and they shape ideas and debates that we still have today. So finally, let's wrap up with you reflecting on this. I would like you to do this. There's some questions below. Choose one question and post a signed response explaining your viewpoint, and offer 1 to 2 subpoints to back up your view. So basically, I'm going to give you some things to respond to. Pick one. What's your opinion, and what are some kind of points to back up your view, right? So an informed opinion. Question 1 is, many historians feel that the U.S. would not have become a nation if anti-slavery founders hadn't compromised. Do you think they should have not compromised, and why? Some people would say, well, maybe they shouldn't have. Maybe we should have had 2 countries or some other thing. I don't know. What would have been the result of the anti-slavery forces if the anti-slavery forces refused to settle? It's just a little fun kind of historical, what if question. Question 2, this is our presentism question, kind of relating this to some issues we looked at last time. Imagine that you are a white person living in a slave colony in the mid-1700s. Everyone in your social circle thinks that slavery is a morally ethical, even God-ordained system, right? That was the dominant view in enslaved colonies. Do you agree with them, and why or why not? What does your answer say about the nature of presentism? So again, trying to put yourself in the minds of someone that you deeply, deeply, deeply disagree with. Would you still agree with them, and why or why not, right? And then the third question is, again, you're picking one. The only way right now, currently, to stop gerrymandering from happening would be a federal law. There was a major Supreme Court case a few years ago where the Supreme Court could have intervened and they chose not to. They chose to mostly let gerrymandering continue and let state legislatures and courts battle it out. So right now, probably not. The Supreme Court is probably not going to be making any decisions on that anytime soon. And yet, any proposed federal law would violate many political and legal conceptions of states' rights. So there are even people who think gerrymandering is terrible, who think, well, the Constitution said that states can do this and that should be protected. What do you think? In this squabble over federalism, who should win and why? So which side should prevail? And why do you think that? So again, pick one of these three, come up with a response, make sure your name is pinned to that response so you get credit for it, post it to the Lino board. Thank you. Hope your first week was interesting and enlightening. And next week, we're going to get more into kind of the topical stuff. Our first topic for next week is going to be this, Strange Fruit, the Legacies of Racialized Slavery in American Life. So what was unique about America's slave system? How did it shape life back then? And how is it arguably still shaping life now? Even though it was a long time ago, we still feel some of the effects of it. So I know this is a topic a lot of you are kind of nervous about. I will say in the past that I've gotten really good feedback from students that I'm able to talk about something that makes most people want to run out of the room screaming in a way that kind of invites people in and doesn't attack anyone. So if you're feeling a little nervous about that, I hope I do a good job of presenting this really important issue and presenting some ideas I think are really crucial. Thank you all, and I'll see you next week.